Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the Payola scandals of the 50s and 60s and how Alan Freed and Dick Clark helped shape rock and roll into what we know today. So stick around. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We will be, October 16th is the big trip to Nashville. I'll be playing on the Ryman Plaza stage ahead of the Jason Isbell show, so that's going to be great. And then November 1st, I'll be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for a Halloween party. And then November 11th, I'll be at Harrah's Northern California in Ione. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Okay, so our story, we're going to start off looking at these two main characters, which is Alan Freed and Dick Clark. And as I was kind of reading into this and kind of getting to know these characters a little bit, they're very similar in their impact and their kind of, in their drive and their like ideology sort of. But you had one guy, Alan Freed, who was this kind of threw caution to the wind, very kind of bombastic dude, and very outspoken and very, like a really, really type A guy. And then Dick Clark, who was a little bit younger, a little bit more careful, a little bit more, honestly, he was kind of smarter in the way that he kind of handled things. And they were each other's direct competitors, so they're in the same business with the same artists around in this, but one of them experiences a fantastic fall from grace while the other one kind of escapes relatively unscathed. So Alan Freed was born, I think, in 1921. Yeah. So he's born in 1921 in Pennsylvania, and he grows up in just kind of a musical family. He's not, these are radio DJs we're talking about. These aren't artists. So, but he was in like a jazz band, I think, for a little bit, like growing up. I think he played trombone or some brass instrument. I think it was trombone. And, so he graduates high school in 1939, and, I think in 1940, somewhere in the 40s, 42, he gets drafted into the Army. Now, he ends up in the Signal Corps. So apparently, when you get drafted, you just get drafted into the Army, and then you take, tests to figure out what your aptitudes are and kind of what jobs you would be good at. Because he was already kind of involved with radio, he'd worked as an announcer and a little bit here and there. He ends up in the Signal Corps, which was pretty short-lived because relatively soon after getting into the Army, I think he's only in there for, a few months, he gets an ear infection, or a double ear infection, which leads to what's called double mastoiditis, which I guess is an infection in a bone in the inner ear that now we treat pretty easily with antibiotics. But at the time, it would make you deaf if it was bad enough and have like lasting impact on the rest of your life. It reduces his hearing enough that he can't do his job in the Army, and he's discharged for medical stuff. Now, and it kind of, he describes that as kind of dashing his dreams of being in a band, like, you know, because he, like, on the orchestra side, because I guess it was enough to damage his ability to do that, but not enough to, you know, like, he could still hear through headphones, like, and be a radio DJ, so he just stuck with that. So he jumps, you know, both feet into the radio business, and pretty quickly here, he ends up in Ohio, and in 1945, he joins WKBN, and he's earning like $42 a week. So it's not making a crazy amount of money here. He's just a local radio DJ. And let's see here. He kind of bounces around too. So he was in Youngstown, Ohio, then he moves to Akron, Ohio. And I think it was at WAKR is where things really kind of get going for him, because he ends up somewhere in here meeting this guy that owned a record store, like, down the street, basically. And this is where the wave of R&B is, like, building. So, like, Chuck Berry's making noises, and, you know, you got the teenagers and everybody, like, you know, things are starting to happen here. And this guy that owns the record store realizes that the records aren't just selling to a black audience. He's got white kids in his store buying these records, sort of, and, you know, not sort of, much to the chagrin of their parents. So this is, you know, we're still in segregation here. This is the 50s. And R&B was like black music. And, like, music was still very, you know, segregated as far as TV and radio goes. But this guy notices that the white kids are starting to buy the records, and that sort of opened the market up. So he goes to Alan Freed and is like, hey, I'll sponsor an hour on your radio show. You just direct people to my record store, like, to tell them that's where you're getting the records from. And that works. And so Alan Freed, you know, his show, he's somewhere in here he gets the nickname the Moondog, which I couldn't figure out exactly how that nickname came about. But so he adopts that into his radio show, and he starts, you know, his fans are the Moondoggers, and he's, you know, this is Alan Freed, King of the Moondoggers, was kind of his thing. And he starts playing these R&B records in what will become, you know, rock and roll records, and people love it. Like, it's immediately a giant success. They're getting all kinds of fan mail. They're getting all kinds of letters and, you know, phone calls. The phones are ringing off the hook for these records that he's playing. And he starts to show his real kind of commitment to civil rights in a way where, like, there were white artists covering some of these songs, and he wouldn't play their records. He was playing the original black artists on purpose. That was his thing. And it, you know, and it was working. He was building this massive audience. And then he starts coming under pressure, and he's immediately very staunch in his stance, and he's willing to get in trouble over it. And so he makes a little bit of a misstep here somewhere where he's offered a job at a different radio station, and he takes it, but then, like, in which this kind of illustrates a little bit of his problem, I think, because he's really impulsive with some of this stuff. So this other job offer comes in, he takes it, only later to find out that he had signed a non-compete with the radio station that he was at. Basically takes him off the airwaves for a full year. So, like, he just makes this, just steps on a rake unnecessarily and costs himself a year of airtime, because the radio station obviously fired him, because you can't just be, you know, accepting other job offers and trying to leave, and then they just let you come back knowing you're going to leave later. Like, yeah, so he gets fired. But anyway, he ends up back on the air, and this is where Alan Freed coins the term rock and roll, because, like, you know, that term wasn't really branded to the music. You'd find that line in songs here and there, like rockin' and rollin', and, you know, like, you'd find the terms rock and the term roll separately in songs, but, like, it wasn't the way that we say it now, which is like it's rock and roll music. That was Alan Freed that coined that term. And it partly was a way to sidestep some prejudices because R&B was black music and, you know, pop music was white music. Rock and roll sort of gave everybody a, oh, I don't listen to this or that. I'm a rock and roll guy. So it kind of did a little bit to tear down the racial divide of the music genre. And like I said, he just jumps in both feet and starts experiencing a crazy amount of success. He also, like you can imagine, the music business in the 50s, especially in what is now called rock and roll, there's a lot of pressure on what songs get picked and what ones don't. So these independent record labels, especially the independent ones, I mean, everybody did it, but it was a much more, it made sense as a tactic for these independent labels to bribe radio DJs to play their stuff. And they would do it in all kinds of ways, some ways more subtle than others. Sometimes it was just $100 bill tucked into a record sleeve and the DJ would put your record on. And that starts to happen with an alarming amount of frequency here. And, you know, during the 50s here, it's pretty hush-hush, like Freed's not out there saying that's what he's doing. He would later say that he never played a record he didn't like. It was just, you know, some of this stuff came with money. That turns out to be much less true, I think, later on in the story. But regardless, kids are listening to the music. People are buying records. It's working. Like, and rock and roll is having the effect that it's famous for. Like the younger generation, it didn't matter what you called it. The younger generation was in, and they were buying the records, and they were going to dance halls, and it was like the racial divide in America, at least in the North, like this is in, Ohio and New York, the racial divide starts to kind of crumble. Like all these kids are, race is an afterthought. They're all at these dance halls together and they're all, having a good time. And that does bother the parents of those kids. And to the point where at one point here, so Alan Freed gets a TV show for his, music. And it's going great, but they're catching some flack, like I said, for the mixed race audiences that are there. And it kind of comes to a head when I think it's Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were on Freed's TV show. And there's this, you can go back. I couldn't find the actual footage of this happening, but you can find footage of the Teenagers on Alan Freed's show. And at one point, they're, going through their number, and Frankie Lyman, in the middle of an instrumental break, steps off the stage and starts dancing with a white girl on camera on national television, which, in the moment, not an issue. He just gets off stage, dances with this girl for a few seconds, gets back on stage, finishes his song, and, the show finishes as normal, but sponsors freak out. And they're calling the TV station like, okay, you can only put white acts on your show if we're going to sponsor you. Which obviously doesn't work for Alan Freed. He ends up getting fired over that deal. So the TV show ends. And I might have jumped forward a little bit in the timeline here. I think I did. Because before that happened, I think it was in 1952. Yeah. 1952, this is in Cleveland. Alan Freed, who at this stage of the game, he was just, he knew his show was popular because, like I said, he's getting fan mail and phone calls, but it wasn't like, he wasn't making a ton of money at this point. You don't really know what the market's going to be like out there. He gets the idea to put on a dance. And he called it the Moondog Coronation Ball, and they did it at the Cleveland Arena, which I think their capacity that they, or at least the tickets they sold, I think was like 8,000 people, which is big because, especially for the time, you're dealing with a bunch of high school kids. And the reason why part of that show worked is because of their proximity to, there was like 2 high schools within 5 minutes walking distance, apparently, to where this radio station was. And so people are seeing their friends on TV at these dance parties and stuff later. So it was this very like localized thing. So he wasn't super sure who was going to show up to this dance. They sell their 8,000 tickets, and he's got artists lined up. I'm not sure if Chuck Berry was there at that first one. It was Paul Williams, Tiny Grimes. Oh, the Dominoes were there. And so they put the show on. They sell out their 8,000 tickets. Well, the night of the show comes around, and 20,000 people show up. And which is, at first, great, because there's this giant amount of interest in the show. Problem is, logistically, they were not prepared for that. And a few minutes into the show, the crowd crushes down the gates, and like 7,000 people come blowing in to this arena on top of the 8,000 that were already in there. Arena might be, it's called the arena. 8,000 seats is a relatively small arena, but so when this extra 7,000 people make it into the building, it becomes unmitigated chaos. The show the fire department's there freaking out, like this is a hazard. There was, on top of that, it's a mixed race crowd, so the authorities aren't super into this anyway, and it turns into a complete disaster. And what adds to the disaster, so like I said, the show gets stopped, and this is canceled. We can't do it this way. The reaction of the police and the older generation in general was they did not want this. This was like, kids out at night, no inhibitions, dancing around, hooting and hollering, making all kinds of noise was not their idea of, a good use of their children's time. So they do their best to just nail Alan Freed with a bunch of different charges over this deal, mostly inciting a riot. And then they tack on a bunch of stuff. So there's the arena, big party, big, riot going on, like everything gets disbanded. In the area around the arena, other crimes are happening that there's no evidence to suggest they were connected to the dance at all. There's a couple of stabbings, there's a robbery, there's some other, but this is, Cleveland at night. So who knows what is actually connected to the event itself. It doesn't matter. They attach that to Alan Freed. So they're kind of blaming him for these stabbings and, robberies or whatever that happened. So it's a bit of a fiasco, to the point where the next night, Alan Freed gets on the radio, and his first impulse is to apologize, and that you can find on YouTube is him saying, I just want to come out and apologize for, last night we had, 10,000 extra people show up, and 7,000 of them burst their way through the doors and caused a problem, and I'm so sorry for those of you that have suffered, and I suffered right along with you, and all this other stuff. So he kind of gets ahead of it, but and eventually those, the charges of inciting a riot are dropped. That doesn't stick to him in the long run, but it did, you would think it would make them be more careful in the future, which wasn't necessarily true. But anyway, so things go on here. Alan Freed's got this reputation now. He's the wild rock and roller dude with a mixed race audience and no rules. Like they're just doing whatever they feel like. And success keeps on coming. And then I think in 1954, he gets a job offer to move to New York and basically just take his show with him. So he sticks with the whole King of the Moondoggers thing and, takes his show to the big city. This is where things get a little complicated, because now he's this wildly popular radio DJ in New York in the 50s. He gets tangled up with a guy named Levy, who, what was his first name? I'll find it here in a second. This guy, I'm just blanking on his first name. He's a very important part of the story here, because he was a pretty shady character, pretty heavily involved with the mob. And, it's worth noting that was, it was Morris Levy was his name. Morris Levy. He was kind of the guy for the music business in New York at the time. And he is a full-on, like I said, involved with the mob is like putting it lightly. This guy would go on to have a reputation for like threatening violence against, artists and songwriters and producers who didn't want to, play ball and give him his under-the-table cut of whatever money they were making. So he's a pretty dark character to get involved with, and Alan Freed kind of jumps in with both feet. Doesn't seem to have a whole lot of reservations about that part. And that cuts two ways, because on the one hand, okay, now we're into shady business dealings and shady money. On the other hand, he's got access to way more money than he did before, and he's getting, the mob, while corrupt and dark and evil, was pretty good at music promotion and, connecting people in the right ways. So, but Alan Freed ends up pretty darn tangled up here. So, like I said, he moves to New York and gets this stuff going. And this is, I think actually in New York is when he had the TV show got going and all that stuff. I think I might be wrong about that. So this is kind of the wave of his life so far, Alan Freed's life. If you're Alan Freed, that's the way you would tell the story. A little bit in here, you start to see what would come out later in congressional hearings is he was taking a lot of money under the table to play these records. And he would kind of put some effort in to make it not quite so obvious, but other times he wouldn't. And then sometimes, like, the culture in radio had been that way for a long time. Like back in, even jazz artists would pay, piano players to have their sheet music on and like play it at clubs and stuff like that. That was kind of a normal thing. But it really turns into, like I said, tucking $100 bills into stuff. Then it evolves even harder into the royalties game. So this is where you get stuff like Chuck Berry being furious because Chuck Berry writes Maybelline, right? And he writes it. It was called Ida Red, but then there was already a song called Ida Red, and there was like they were concerned about some copyright issues, so he just changed out Ida Red for Maybelline. And put a ton of work into that record, and there was something he did like 36 takes of it or something to get it just right. And like, Chuck Berry puts all this work into making Maybelline. Chuck Berry is involved with Alan Freed, and after the song comes out and is a great success, Chuck Berry gets a hold of the record. And after the record is out for sale is when Chuck Berry reads the back of the record sleeve and realizes that Alan Freed was given 30% of the writing royalties on this thing. It was Alan Freed and another guy whose name escapes me, but another like radio guy. And Chuck Berry realizes that he's kind of been taken for a ride. And Alan Freed wasn't in the room for any of this. He wasn't involved at all. They just gave him writing royalties to make sure he would play it on his Moondog show. And while that is, again, cuts both ways, because on the one hand, it worked. That song goes on to be, the famous song that we all know. And who knows if Alan Freed never played it, would it have been that big? Who knows? Chuck Berry eventually sues for his writing credits and wins, but that's not till like the 80s, and Alan Freed had been dead for a while at that point. So, but that's the kind of stuff that's going on. And then you realize that there's the record company that Levy owned was like paying Alan Freed's mortgage, and there was a bunch of shady gifts and things that were given in the mix here. And so it starts to get pretty murky pretty fast. Now contrast that story with our next character, which is Dick Clark. Dick Clark was playing, very similar artists. In fact, many of the same artists. Like there was, Dick Clark's, I think it was the Bandstand was his TV show. And there was a lot of overlap as far as artists go with Alan Freed and Dick Clark. The difference is that Dick Clark was this very clean-cut, very kind of, the word that comes to mind is respectable, but I don't know if that's right. But he kept his show a lot more kind of tight run, and you didn't have these chaotic scenes of people jumping up and dancing and, you know, causing a scene like you did on Alan Freed's show. And Dick Clark was also, so he grew up in a radio family. Like his dad owned the radio station that he started at before he went out on his own. And so he had some good like family and business connections in that space to begin with. So he is doing many of the same kind of things, but he's way smarter about it. So we're like, Dick Clark would own stakes in record companies, distribution like publishing companies, the radio station, the TV, publishing houses. Like he owned interests in these companies that were all part of the machine that was feeding the music business, where Alan Freed didn't own any of that. He was just taking cash bribes basically to do this stuff. So you could argue that Dick Clark had more to gain from, like, Dick Clark probably made way more money than Alan Freed did because he owned so much of the machine behind the music. And but like I said, so you have these two separate shows, many of the same artists. Dick Clark did rotate in more white artists, and it sounds like he did that, like, you know, he wasn't taking a outward stand on this is black music and we're going to play it with the original artist. Like, Dick Clark had less of that out front, despite the fact that that is what he did. He had plenty of black artists on his show, and he, you know, treated everybody with the same amount of respect, and he just never made an issue out of it the way that Alan Freed did. And like I said, they're pretty direct competitors at this point. So back over to Alan Freed for a second. We start to get some run-in with our past characters on this show, where, so after the TV show ends, Alan Freed decides he's going to take everybody on tour. So, because he's not making money from the radio, he's not making money from TV now. So he's going, and he's, you know, he takes everybody on tour with him. Some of the people on that tour were Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Buddy Holly shows up here. And this is the stage where, like, so Buddy Holly goes on tour with Alan Freed's, you know, roadshow deal. And Waylon Jennings is the bass player. So, like, this is the tour that they were on when Buddy Holly flies home and dies in the plane crash. That tour was being promoted and organized by Alan Freed. So this is like, they're all together, and they're all on the tour buses together, and this is all happening at the same time. And so this is like right before Jerry Lee Lewis blows his own career up with the whole like child bride thing. And, you know, so that's all happening. Because in the past episodes we talk about, oh yeah, they went on tour and they did this, or oh yeah, this happened, then they went on tour. It kind of, I don't think I've done a very good job of highlighting exactly what that takes and the other people that were involved. Without guys like Alan Freed and Dick Clark who do the same kind of thing later, those tours don't happen. The logistics and the bookings and the, you know, that stuff all happens because of Alan Freed and, you know, and later because of Dick Clark. So, but this is where, I think in Chicago, I want to say it was in Chicago. I got to find the date on this. 1958, I guess. Oh no, it was in Boston. Okay. So 1958 in Boston, same kind of problem that we're dealing with here, where like the authorities are not into this at all. And Alan Freed's shows were always chaotic. Like they didn't put a lot of effort into like crowd management at all. And so we get this show in Boston where Jerry Lee Lewis is doing his thing, and the cops show up, and the crowd is getting out of their seats, and they're doing jumping around and dancing and everything else. And the cops tell Alan Freed, hey, get these kids back in their seats or the show's over. And so Alan Freed runs onto stage while Jerry Lee Lewis is in the middle of his show, takes the mic and goes, hey kids, the police are here and they want you back in your seats because I guess the, you know, Boston Police Department doesn't want you to have fun. Which, goes over about as well as you think. I mean, I guess initially they do kind of quiet and go back to their seats, but then Jerry Lee just gets them fired right back up again. And then the cops tell the lighting guy to turn the house lights on. So they do. And everybody's confused by that. They kind of have another moment of getting kind of raucous and, everything else. And Alan Freed is doing his best to kind of calm this whole thing down. And he, goes back out on stage, does another kind of calm everybody down moment. But the cop says, nope, the lights stay on for whatever reason. And that just obviously doesn't work. Like, Jerry Lee is on stage doing his show, but now the lights are bright, and, it's the show is completely kind of rattled. And then it devolves into total chaos. People are throwing, wine bottles and paper bags up onto the stage, and, they end up getting in a fight with the cops, and this whole thing devolves again into a kind of a riot. And that show gets, ended with, Alan Freed and Jerry Lee and Buddy Holly and everybody else, like, running out to their tour buses and, getting out of there. So, that, again, causes a bit of a problem. And that actually ends up getting Alan Freed fired from WINS. But anyway, so that's kind of got his reputation pretty well cooked, in a way. So now we go back over to Dick Clark. Dick Clark did not have those problems. His show was always very, well regulated. There, his live shows were the same way. They just logistically handled it better. I don't know if you would just pick better venues to where there is a dance area that's not in the middle of all the seats causing issues. So the actual decisions that get made here, somehow Dick Clark shows, not a problem. Same artists, same kind of venues, or, same kind of everything. Dick Clark shows aren't a problem. Alan Freed shows are. And, which makes me kind of put the brakes on my first thought, which is this is a race thing. They're, the authorities are cracking down because of the, black artists and black, attendees. That holds a little bit less water when you realize that Dick Clark was pulling off the same thing with less trouble. So, who knows? But then, this is where the word payola enters the chat. Because there was something in the earlier in the 50s where, quiz shows and, game shows on TV got exposed for cheating. They were feeding correct answers to certain contestants, for better ratings. Because, I guess if you just have 6 questions in a row where you stump all of your, contestants, it's not very good watching for TV. So they made sure that somebody had the right answer at every turn. And then it got pretty messy with who was getting paid and why and all that other stuff. So there's an investigation goes on into that with some political success for the people running those investigations. And right when that well dried up, here comes Alan Freed, poisoning America's youth and, putting them onto the devil's music. So the eye of the government turns to rock and roll here. And they find a pretty deep well of corruption and shenanigans going on in here. And it provided the perfect way to attack rock and roll as an enterprise. So it was because there was, like I said, just corruption was just rampant. And and Alan Freed's involved with the mob here. And there's plenty of threads to pull on. And it starts unraveling pretty quick because it come to find out, it wasn't just these two guys. Tons of DJs across America were taking money from record companies and artists and producers and everybody else to play their records. And so they get drug in front of a congressional hearing. Now, at this stage, by the time this happens, Alan Freed, like I said, he'd been fired already, and his alcoholism was kind of ramping up. He'd been divorced recently. I think it was his second marriage had just ended. He has kids with a couple of different women, and his whole he's deep in debt apparently to the mob and everybody else, because they're paying his mortgage and everything else. So it is not a good time to be Alan Freed. And then you get a congressional subpoena and you got to go talk about the ins and outs of your business dealings. Wow. People are taking deals. other people that were involved, when they get subpoenaed, they're rolling over on other people and telling all the secrets about who's getting paid, how much for what, and why. And so anyway, both of the guys end up in front of Congress. Alan Freed goes a couple of days before Dick Clark does. Now, Dick Clark proved why you keep some corporate distance between you and your shady business dealings. Because at the first sign of trouble, Dick Clark did a great job of divesting from anything that he thought was shady. So, like, he had his web of corporate enterprises that were all getting money from record sales and, you know, deciding who got on the air and everything else. But he wasn't taking the $100 handshake deals. He didn't do any of that stuff. Like, as far as I can tell, in fact, there were times there he got offered writing credits and he turned them down. So where, like, Alan Freed is taking 30% of Maybelline, they tried to do the same kind of thing to Dick Clark, and he said no. Like, why would I didn't write this. Like, why are you putting me in the credits here? He knew why, and it irritated him that they would do that without asking. He turned down like a $7,000 check at one point for royalties that he felt like created a problem. So he was smart enough to stay out in front of this thing. So when when the Payola scandals break and he starts hearing about this in the news, before he even gets subpoenaed, he cuts his ties to all that stuff. He sells off companies. He does, like, he fully divests in anything that he thinks might cause a problem for him later. And that saves his bacon so hard, because then, I think in 1960, or 1959, he ends up, like I said, so first couple of days, Alan Freed in front of Congress being asked questions. And at first he sticks to his story of, I didn't take any bribes. Like, I received gifts after the fact sometimes, but it wasn't like that. And, like, I never played records I didn't like and all this other stuff. And he does a pretty good job of holding his testimony together without incriminating himself for the first little bit of it. But then he makes a big mistake, because one of the congressmen asked him, so these gifts were given to you with an understanding that you would play their songs on the radio? And he goes, yes. And then immediately realizes what he's done. This also, by the way, I should back up a little bit, because at the first wind of trouble here with the Payola scandals, the TV, I think it was ABC or CBS, the TV companies and radio companies go to their DJs and make them sign an affidavit that said, I was not taking Payola for my record choices. And there's a little bit of shenanigans here, because the affidavit that gets in front of Alan Freed was a very broad, like, it defined Payola in this very broad way, where it was basically like, if you had taken anything at all for record plays, you're guilty. So Alan Freed says, I'm not signing this. There's no way. I'll perjure myself immediately if I sign this. And then Dick Clark does sign an affidavit, but then they found out that they were not the same words. Like, Dick Clark's lawyers got in front of this thing and got Payola defined much more strict. I think in Dick Clark's affidavit, I think it defined Payola as, like, money taken, like, it specified that it was paid beforehand for record sales, and, like, kind of opened him up to gifts after the fact that would definitely have an impact going forward on future records, like that, because that was a big thing too. So, but like I said, Dick Clark's affidavit, they tweaked the words enough, he signs it, and then, like I said, divests and everything that would have fallen outside of that, and kind of clears himself up. Alan Freed never signed that affidavit and decided, nope, like, I'm going to take this kind of head on here. That was a mistake. Because, like I said, he ends up in front of Congress. At some point in the thing, they ask him, so this was for radio plays? And he says, yes. He gives, like, this concrete yes answer, immediately incriminates himself, and goes on to, like, talk for 45 minutes or something, trying to, like, clarify what he said and kind of dig himself out and talk about, like, what was, when we were making $250,000, what was $10,000? And, like, he's just really just digging himself in a hole. Like, the more he talked, the worse it got. And so, he gets dismissed. And a couple of days later, Dick Clark shows up for his congressional hearing. And that goes much less well for the prosecution here. Because, like I said, Congress was like, they were doing this because they felt like they could end the rock and roll movement. They were trying to get this stuff off the radio, like settle down these wild, interracial parties and everything. Like they were not into it. And they were doing everything they could to just get rock and roll off of TV and the radio. But Dick Clark was ready for him, and he was smart, and he was well-spoken, and he had his ducks in a row when he got there. And so much so to the point where at the end of his testimony, one of the other congressmen was like, thanked him for being there and called him like a fine young man or something. Like it backfired so hard on the, congressional committee trying to get this dude for something. Because all of his answers were really well planned out. He showed up with a statement too, like not everybody else did that. Where like he shows up and they ask him, are you ready to proceed? And he says, yes, but I have a prepared statement that I'd like to make. And this is after they've already drug in a bunch of other small time DJs and everybody's kind of rolling on each other and accusations are getting lobbed back and forth. So in his opening statement, he says, I feel like I've been tried and convicted without a chance to speak my piece here. So now he's pulling the victim card pretty successfully. And then he proceeds to speak for, I think it was like an hour or so, like a long stretch where he's lining out every business deal that he thought might have been, a problem. So he'd already divested months ago. And this was like, he lays out his case in front of Congress really well. And, ends up kind of coming out of this thing looking like a hero and looking like this upstanding citizen who did the right thing. And like I said, not that he wasn't making an ungodly amount of money on royalties and things like from his corporate web of influence, but he manages to keep himself out of the trouble that Alan Freed lands in because Alan Freed is arrested soon after. So like the congressional investigation ends and then Alan Freed gets arrested for like bribery and whatever else. And let's see here. It was, because it was for like, they got him for like $30,000 of bribery or whatever. It was so much more than that. It's crazy. You can actually go back and read the congressional hearing, like transcripts and then the notes of everything and who was ratting out who for how much money. Alan Freed was raking in tens of thousands of dollars per month for the company just on sketchy payola things where it was like, and then there was one account from a guy, some record person that I forgot their name, but like him and Alan Freed didn't like each other. Like they had a falling out over bribery stuff. Like they weren't giving him enough money, I guess. And he tells this story about how they met, like, they were connected through a mutual friend to like kind of go bury the hatchet. They go to dinner at Alan Freed's house. And the end of that story is that guy is paying Alan Freed $500 a month just to play his records when he gives it to him. Like a standing payment of $500 a month. Like, and then that's one guy. And come to find out there were like 15 of those guys. And they were all just sending money with the knowledge that Alan Freed would play their records. So his whole, I never played a record I didn't like act, and I never took a bribe act is like, doesn't hold up very well under congressional scrutiny and with people testifying to the contrary with numbers, dates, and checkbooks open. Like that whole thing falls apart really hard. So he's convicted, and he doesn't spend any time in jail over that deal, but he's fined, I think, he gets put on probation for 6 months, and I think he gets fined, like, it's not very much. It's like $500 or $300 or something, but his career is over, and he never gets back on the radio waves after that deal. And he ends up moving to California and basically drinking himself to death. Alan Freed dies when in his 40s from, sclerosis of the liver. And he kind of after that, like I said, he never recovers and he dies, shortly thereafter. But Dick Clark goes on to have a long career and, kind of continues with the same you know, attitude of expanding the genre. And, you know, he as far as like missionaries for rock and roll goes, Dick Clark's impact continues, and, you know, for decades after this. Like, Dick Clark was involved in the Live Aid concerts in the you know, late 80s. So he just stayed involved, and it worked out fine for him. Now, like I said, it's both of those guys with such similar stories to have such a different outcome is kind of curious to me, because it makes you wonder, like, how much of that was racially motivated and how much of that was just guys doing scummy stuff and getting caught. Because, you know, it doesn't seem like Dick Clark had to endure the same amount of scrutiny about the race angle on his music from there on out either. Like, it just seems to have been much less of, not that it wasn't an issue, it was just much less of an issue on his show. And a lot of it had to do with his, like, clean-cut, good boy image. And, but like I said, Dick Clark was not that lucky, or Alan Freed was not that lucky, and ends up, you know, penniless and drinking himself to death. He is, however, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their, like, inaugural class. I think in 1986 was the first, you know, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame year. And this is a little funny posthumous story here. So Dick Clark was cremated, and I think he was his remains were in a cemetery, I think in Cleveland, and somewhere in Ohio. And somehow somebody thought it was a good idea for his his urn with his ashes to be moved to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where they stayed for years. And it was like, so you'd go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and there's like pictures on the wall and records and whatever, and this like silver box that's like, there's Alan Freed. Like these, did I say Dick Clark before? I might have said the wrong name. Alan Freed was cremated, and his remains were placed on display at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I guess didn't seem that weird at the time at first, but eventually it does. And I think in 2012, I gotta find that, like, much later on, basically the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame calls his son and is like, hey, we don't feel comfortable having your dad's remains in the museum. We think you should take him elsewhere. And and they made this big like TV thing about it, how like Alan Freed's son had to like go in and like get his dad's box, and like comes walking out the front of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame all like depressed looking, like, you know, oh, how could they kick my dad out? And I was like, well, I mean, pretty weird. I mean, I've been to a few of these Hall of Fame museums, and like that would be a little jarring to be like, oh, that's his urn sitting there. Like, so now the family's gripe at the time was that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was kind of being disrespectful, because when they moved him, like when they made that phone call to get the ashes taken out, it happened to coincide with when they were building a temporary exhibit for Beyonce, and they needed the square footage for the Beyonce exhibit. So, I mean, the museum would say, like, look, like, we're not shrinking the Alan Freed exhibit at all. Like, there's just a temporary thing for the Beyonce thing. We're asking you to take these remains out because we don't think having human remains in the museum is a good idea. Like, but the family didn't want to see it that way. So, like, it depends on your proclivities, because that would be a weird phone call to get. Like, hey, we need you to come get your dad because we've got this. We need more room for Beyonce's leotards, and your dad's really cramping the space. Like that might have been a tough pill to swallow. Regardless, his son comes and picks up his remains on camera, making this big thing out of it. And he ends up buried, I think, in Cleveland, I think. And he gets... Alan Freed has one of the coolest headstones I've ever seen. It's this giant full-size jukebox with a laser engraved image of him, like in front of his microphone, and, you know, and on the back it's like a laser engraved jukebox with, like, you know, records and everything else. So it's like, it's a pretty cool monument to Alan Freed, but it's because that got built so much later, because his urn was kept in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a bunch of years. And but anyway, just a weird, ending to that story. But then, like I said, Dick Clark goes on. His career stretches on until, I think he died I think Dick Clark died in 2012. But after winning a string of awards and being recognized all over the place for his role in rock and roll music. And he really did manage to kind of keep his reputation out of the dirt by being a shrewd business guy and kind of knowing which way the wind was blowing and making good decisions, which, I think is probably the better way to go of the two. But anyway, so, and that payola in the music industry would come back again in the 80s. Like, the mob gets involved again, and there's, a whole list of ways to get around the, things that tripped up Alan Freed and Dick Clark in the 50s. And there would be another round of, congressional hearings and everything else. But at the time, that really did kind of quash the whole, paying for radio play thing. But yeah, and then actually the guy, Levy, ends up getting indicted for, like, racketeering, basically. I don't think it was racketeering, but it was something to that effect, for like a $2.5 million, unpaid royalties thing to some of the writers at his record label. And his ties to the mob get kind of drug out in the open. He gets sentenced to prison, but he dies, I think, of cancer, like right before he's supposed to go to jail. So, like, this sketchy mob guy that Alan Freed got tangled up with, the curtains get pulled back on that deal too, just many years later. I think that was in the 80s that he died. But anyway, so that was the first blip of corruption in the rock and roll scene. But like, so without it, I mean, who knows what songs would have been popular, and who knows what would have made the radio, and who knows, some of these, smaller acts that have these, one-hit wonders, they're still great songs, and they're still fun to listen to and dance to. So, like, it's, corruption aside, you can't downplay Alan Freed and Dick Clark's impact on the music that we still listen to and love today. And kind of that portion of America healing itself, from the Jim Crow era through the civil rights movement. Like, these guys are knee deep in that process, and who knows what decisions would have gotten made, what impact that had. If you're a little kid watching white and black teenagers dance together at Alan Freed's show, and then your parents are telling you some racist, worldview, but you've just seen this thing where they all seem like people to me and they're all having a good time. Like, what did those kids' decisions growing up turn out to be? And what, those were kids that would go on to vote and go on to, be involved in the civil rights movement and be involved in, everything since then. So I hesitate to just write off Alan Freed and Dick Clark as like, oh, those were the corruption guys, and that's why the music got popular. Like, I don't know if that's true. They had a monumental impact on American culture that we still feel like you can still see its impact clear as day on America today as we know it. So they're a part of the history worth knowing, complicated characters, but aren't we all? So that is the Payola scandals of the 50s and 60s. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you next week.